Thank you all so much for showing up today. I very much appreciate it. I hope that this is one of the better PowerPoints that you see today. How about that as a way to get us kicked off? So as the title hopefully reflects, and I don't want to set anybody's expectations differently. This is really for those of us who are really getting started on the journey of Agile estimation. So I know some of you are very well acquainted with Agile methods and approaches. Some of this is going to probably be very basic for you, maybe filling in some gaps. But the intent of this, the scope on this, is for those of us who are trying to approach the idea of estimation. Maybe we've tried it, maybe we've had some success, maybe we've had some challenges, or maybe this is just something that we want to get familiar with because we want to start using estimation in the work that we do. And we want to think about sort of the right way to get started with that. And again, with our Agile roots, with our Agile sort of mindset in a pragmatic and practical way. So those of you who have spent any time in any conversations with me know that I can be excessively pragmatic and really want to leave today in the next 45 minutes or so with some basic guidance in terms of things that you and your teams can consider if you want to get started with estimation, or if you want to consider how your current processes for estimation, you may want to think about them and evolve them. So with that, getting started with Agile estimation. So for those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, I work for a company, Lightspeed here, and you can see a number of items that we have, and Maggie kicked us off with a little bit more information in the chat as well. But we really want to make sure, as part of our mission, that we're making people's work more valued, productive, and fulfilling. And we are honored to receive the most outstanding Agile training and consulting firm in 2020 and a number of other awards. We won't go through all of those here, but again, Lightspeed, our organization, is really boutique focused on lean and agile ways of working and helping folks improve the way that they work. So with that, a little bit about me. As Maggie had mentioned, I'm the director of Agile Consulting at Lightspeed. But a lot of what I do, my primary role really is an instructor, educator, and senior Agile coach, not just the gray hair, but I've been doing it for a while. As part of that, 25 plus years in technology throughout all areas of the software development lifecycle. Over a decade and a half of that has been in senior leadership roles. And really the reason why that matters isn't to give you sort of a summary of my resume, but that the things that I'll be talking about are things that I've learned with my own teams in trying to become more little a agile, as I call it. So agile as a means to an end, not as the destination. And as part of that, the teams that I've had the opportunity and the honor of working with, we've experimented with myriad estimation techniques over dozens of products and projects and made countless mistakes, or AKA learned from each experience. So I can also tell you a lot of things that I wouldn't do again that I've tried before with the best of intentions that didn't work out. So why do we want to estimate? And this may seem like a rhetorical question, but it's really not. And so if I could just ask folks, if we could just, a couple of minutes, if you've got some ideas in the chat, could you throw in, why do you want to estimate? You're obviously here for a reason. There's probably other things you could be doing over your lunch hour, if you're on the East Coast especially, but you're here today investing the time in this conversation for a reason, presumably. So why do you want to estimate? Could you just throw your thoughts in the chat and then I'll read them out? Look on my other monitor over here. Don't be shy. See nothing. Anybody support planning? Okay, thanks, Stephen Curry. We need some way to know how long it would take to do the work for planning purposes, better forecasts. Roger, I like t-shirt sizes because accurate estimation isn't predictive of actual performance. To become better and forecasting, target deliverables, time management, establish realistic expectations for the business, some level of certainty regarding project time and cost, know when to split epics. Perfect. Feel free, please, to keep throwing other ideas or reasons that you have in the chat. But I'm going to go ahead and go to this next slide. I said to our internal team, I have two pictures that I like to use in every presentation if I ever can. You get one of the two, which is my owl. which I just absolutely adore. The other one is a praying kitten, but you have to be in a different live stream for that one. I don't have that one today. So the items that you're putting in the chat, a lot of these really align to why others are looking to estimate. So for those of you who may be threw an item in the chat and then saw somebody else's, you may have one or two reasons why you want to estimate, but this is basically the, all of the above type answer. So some reasons why organizations estimate that make sense. So one, and for me, this is one of the things that was a late stage learning for me after doing estimation with the teams that I've worked with for quite some time. The first one is better and shared understanding. A number of you who've been in the project management world have probably heard the quote about, I find plans to be useless, but planning to be indispensable. There is an analog to that for me about estimates being useless. Let's not say that they're useless, but that a key byproduct is better and shared understanding. So when we actually look at a item to be estimated, part of the estimation process, if we're doing it well, is making sure that there's shared understanding about what done looks like, about what good looks like. And that to me is one of the most important and often undervalued benefits of estimation. A number of you in the chat had referenced this idea of planning capacity. So how much is going to fit in a sprint or iteration or a release? We need, even with the agile, the agile approach of, yes, well, we're going to just keep doing things until we're done in every sprint, et cetera. That doesn't work in the real world, right? We need to be able to understand how much work we can get done in each iteration, each sprint, or each release, and so that we're doing things properly and we're also not creating tech debt and those sorts of things. Related to that, and a number of you put this, at least there was one reference to splitting epics, but splitting stories. Are these stories small enough to develop? Another good sort of byproduct of the process is that if it becomes too big, too amorphous, when we're trying to estimate, then we know that we need to split those stories. And that can be a really effective way to know when we need to split them. A number of you also brought up this idea about when we'll be done. So for stakeholders, it is a reality of we need to know realistically when we think that a feature, a release, some delivery is going to be done. That's important. And it's a realistic expectation that we should be able to help support with our customers and stakeholders. Relatedly, from a budgeting perspective, we need to know how much the work, not just in the aggregate, is going to cost, but on a particular feature basis in some cases, or a particular release. So it's important to really understand through estimation what we extrapolate in terms of the cost of that work. And then based on the cost of that work, we really want to be looking at cost-benefit analysis. And that isn't necessarily everybody who's in this meeting today. But from a business perspective, we really, really want to make sure that the work that we're doing, we have the ability to see if the effort that we're putting into it and the investment is actually likely to result in the desired outcome. And if we don't know how much that work ultimately costs, then there's no way for us to do an ROI calculation. So this is all of the above. All of these are benefits. And this is not exhaustive in terms of some of the benefits, but these are some of the key ones that we have. And I'm trying to read the chat items. I think I'll probably, on most of these, unless they're immediate, we'll table some of the Q&A to later in the process to make sure that we get through all of the content. And then I'm happy to answer any questions that I can or to address any of the questions that come up. So one of the things that's interesting to me about agile ways of working in estimation specifically is that there can be some, let's just say, spirited debate in the Twitter sphere, the LinkedIn sphere, as far as agile ways of working in estimation specifically. So these hopefully aren't fighting words, but I think that this is really important for us to talk about and something to really think about in your own team's context, your own context about estimation before you jump in. So let's hold up and wait a minute. From my perspective and experience, not all work and not all teams get a net benefit from estimation. And I hope these aren't fighting words, but I think it's important to think about why we want to estimate. Yep. Thank you, Andy, by the way, for it was an Eisenhower quote. I wasn't sure where that originated. So some questions that I'd ask before implementing estimation with my teams. What are we going to use them for? So I am a big advocate of making sure that we don't use weapons we don't use metrics to weaponize or gamify the work that teams do. And one of the reasons that I think there's such a spirited debate about whether people should estimate and how people should estimate is that things like velocity then become sort of a carrot and stick type situation. And that's, I think, really inappropriate. And we need to really be thinking about why we're using these estimates. And from my perspective, the estimate should primarily be for the team's internal use as a diagnostic, rather than using them to try to set impossible goals. The other is the nature of our work compatible with estimation? For some of the teams that I regularly work with who are technical operations, InfoSec, those sorts of teams, if I'm getting the same type of requests, support type requests, from dozen or break fix type items or support work requests a day, similar to this one, why would I size this work? There's really not a benefit in that if it is very similar work that is happening on a regular basis. It's slowing me down without a whole lot of benefit in doing so. Is our work team-based or generally solo contributor? So if I'm doing work as a solo contributor, a lot of the value of estimation, team-based estimation, doesn't really have a place there. If I'm doing that work on my own, why am I sizing that with any level of specificity? Another is, do we have lots of shared team members across projects and programs, and or is there a regular amount of resource reallocation? I don't like calling humans resources. That's why you see the air quotes there. But team-based estimates, the things that we'll largely talk about here, are team-specific. So a particular metric for a high-performing team that has a lot of domain experience and understands the product and the platform and the tooling and everything as well. If you try to use those same estimates for a different team, or you've got a sort of combined team from partially allocated team members, those numbers don't scale. And so they're not really useful because they lose their value because of the inconsistency in terms of what those numbers mean. And then related to a number of the above, if we've got historical metrics, especially for support, break fix type items, there are other tools that are available that can show throughput over a period of time, especially if you've got enough data there to tell you how long things will take from the time they come in to the time they're delivered. And if you don't have a lot of variability, if there's not a lot of standard deviation, then you can use that data without having to estimate it because you actually have empirical data to be used. So these would just be some things that I would be cognizant of before you start estimating. Make sure that you understand why you're doing it and that there's a good likelihood that you will get the benefits that you're expecting. So what is an estimate? That seems sort of silly, 20 minutes into a conversation to say, what is an estimate? But I think this is important just to remind us, it's not just a guess itself, it's an educated guess. And it combines historical performance, how have we done previously, plus an understanding of scope. Based on that conversation that I was alluding to earlier, conversations, we understand a little bit more about what done looks like, what good looks like, what we need to do, what we don't need to do is at least as important. And then that working knowledge. And with those items all together, we can derive an estimate. So it is a guess, but it is an educated guess. And the educated part of that is really essential. So how to get started estimating? And again, some of you have been doing estimation probably for a decade, couple of decades. So this may be the way that you approach it. You may do something differently. But again, these are some basic approaches that I think almost anybody can use if you want to start your journey to estimation. And if you don't do this today, you can look at this and say, maybe this is something that you want to try with your teams in your context. But when we talk about estimation isn't monolithic. And this idea that we have in general agile ways of working, thinking about how we approach a backlog, right? progressive elaboration as things get closer. It's a similar sort of construct when we talk about estimation. So based on a planning horizon, we can start off with high-level estimates. T-shirt sizes are a pretty common approach, and one thing that we'll talk through a little bit more. When I'm looking at my multi-year roadmap, and as I get into things like quarterly planning, I don't want precision or the veneer of precision. So the idea of using numbers that make it look precise, we really want to avoid that. We want to not intentionally or unintentionally give folks the idea that these big high-level estimates on work that we don't really even understand in any detail yet, that we have precision there. And so we explicitly use things like T-shirt sizes so that we don't give the veneer of precision. But as we start progressing from that high-level sort of roadmap view and even into quarterly planning, as we're moving into these team backlogs, you can start to see a split of these subsets of these smaller T-shirt sizes or these larger story sizes at that point. Then that starts again moving us gradually into that next level of precision based on the timing and that progressive elaboration as we get closer to working on the work. When we get into things like sprint planning and having the sprint plan itself, we do need that level of precision. And at that point, then we would be looking generally at single-digit point size items that go into the sprint. So I use the metaphor, probably, overused, the hammer and the screwdriver, right? It's not like a screw is bad or a nail is bad or a hammer is bad or a screwdriver is bad. It's what's the right tool for the purpose. So based on the right tool, both of them in the right context are useful. And the same thing for these different approaches for estimation. So T-shirt sizes at the larger end of the scale. As we get more precise, we can start using those numeric estimates. So for those of you who haven't approached this before, or those of you who may be, sort of traditional project management mindset backgrounds, I find that sometimes can be a challenge moving from a traditional project management, measuring things in person hours or person days. At the task level, Agile estimation is fundamentally different. The first is that it's based on size and not by time. And size includes things like level of complexity. It is based on a number of different elements of criteria, but it is not time-based in terms of those estimates. And that is a key fundamental difference. Sizing is always relative and not absolute. So, T-shirt sizes are actual points. They're going to be compared to other things that we can wrap our head around, but they're not absolute by design. Again, the same idea is if I tell you something's going to take 4 days, you're going to expect 4 days. But if I tell you that something is a small T-shirt size, I've got explicit variability built into that because we don't have a level of precision at that point just yet. And this gives us the ability to have a relative sizing of work that we can use that also gives us that flexibility in terms of setting appropriate expectations. T-shirt sizes and story points, as mentioned, are really arbitrary. So they're relative to other things, but they don't have a secret decoder ring that you can just say this equals that. I'll show you a bit of a caveat to get you started at the tail end of this conversation, but it's just a starting point. Really, we don't want to have a secret decoder ring where people are expecting that, 8 points equals 3 days or whatever the case may be. Past knowledge and expert advice is used, and that's going to inform what these estimates are. And part of the reason why they're always relative and absolute. My 8-point story and your 8-point story, you're an expert, I'm a novice. What we consider to be an 8-point is going to be different. The other thing that's really important, and back to not weaponizing these metrics, especially those of you that are in positional power, in whatever respect that might be, is estimates are not supposed to be accurate. I can't recall how many conversations I've had where people have tried to hold teams that I've worked with to an accurate estimate. And it's sort of the Princess Bride quote about, I don't think that word means what you think that means. So they're estimates by design. They're supposed to be directionally accurate and representative, but they're estimates and not commitments for a reason. And then the people doing the work estimate the work. So if you are a project manager or if you are a team leader or whatever your role is, you have a very important job, but your job cannot be estimating the work on other people's behalf. Same idea of your 8 and my 8 are not the same. I've had this situation with a client that I worked with, wonderful team, but the lead developer wanted to estimate all of the development efforts on behalf of a team, which included some people who had just been at the organization for less than a year, had limited domain knowledge, limited product knowledge. His estimates were obviously always going to be far smaller for that work because he had a great amount of experience where others who were actually doing the work did not have that. So we need to make sure that the people who are doing the work are the ones who estimate the work. So I've talked about t-shirt sizing. And again, these are just for these initial preliminary estimates. They are not even numeric for a reason. So these are rough sort of ideas. So when we talk about these sizes and sort of this correlation, please don't walk away from the conversation thinking that there is, again, this secret decoder ring, but to just get some sort of conceptual rough ideas. An extra small might be something that's equivalent to a sprint or 2 weeks. A small might be something that is equivalent to a month. Again, your context, it may be different, but just as sort of one way to start thinking about relative sizes and what they might roughly correspond to, a medium could be a quarter, a large could be 2 quarters, and an extra large could be a year. So again, this is not a direct correlation. This matches to that, this maps to that. But to get you thinking about relative size differences, and again, notice that as we increase the size of these estimates, that it is not exactly linear, that we are looking, the bigger that things are, the broader the range is between the prior item on the scale. And you'll notice that not just for the preliminary estimates, but also as we move into the more precise estimates of story points. So you may have a scale traditionally, and this is what I recommend for most of the teams getting started, is that we use a modified Fibonacci scale or sequence, 1, 2, 3, 5, and 8. A scale that is much larger than this, when I see 100-point stories, I sort of not roll my eyes. I look down at the ground sheepishly a little bit, but really we want to have a fairly small scale here. But the important thing on both of these scales, but especially as you look numerically, and really I think the primary reason behind using the Fibonacci sequence is that the further out we get, the larger that things get by design, there's going to be more variability, there's going to be more risk, there's going to be more that's unknown. And so we want that span to be greater between each of those points on the scale as we increase things in size, because there's a lot that we know that we don't know at that point. And that's really important when we start estimating our work. So we talked about the fact that estimates are relative. So again, estimates are abstract and relative without a unit. We want to establish a baseline based on triangulation. So how do we make things relative? Well, we need to really decide how we want to approach that idea of triangulation. And so if Story Z's estimate is based on if it's larger or smaller relative to 2 other stories. So in this example, we have X, Y, and Z. If we say that story X is 3 points, I always have to use cute puppies. I don't know if I can survive on my personality alone. So we're going to have cute puppies in every presentation. And on this one, our story X is 3 points. So I don't know what that means just yet. But if we say that story X is 3 points, the question that we want to ask then for our story Z is story Z larger or smaller than story Y? So I'm doing my initial comparison and I'm saying, well, story Z is smaller than story X. So I know that that pup in the top left-hand corner is smaller than the pup in the bottom. But I know that it is actually bigger than story Y. Well, sorry. Go back one slide just here. So does that make sense? I'm going to pause for a moment. Thank you. Cute puppies for the win. Thank you, Kevin. That's my goal, is if nothing else, you have cute puppy moments here. But puppies aside, or maybe puppies inclusive, does this help? And please throw your comments in the chat if you have any significant questions, but this is really key. When we estimate, this is how we can approach the idea of relative estimation. And what I found is that a lot of teams are challenged just with getting started. And if you have this idea of, picking something and really just comparing it to other things that you've done before, that's how you can really get started with that idea of relative comparisons between different pieces of work. This piece of work compared to this other piece of work that I've done before is larger or smaller. And then as you start doing that incrementally, you'll start to see patterns emerge in terms of what a 1 point, a 2 point, a 3 point, a 5 point, an 8 point story might be. Let's see. Trying to follow up. Sanjeev put some notes in there. Let's see. Kevin, question: are those estimates for the full development cycle where the piece of work is inclusive of deployment? Great question. That one I will try to answer because I think it's a really important point, and I may not have articulated that clearly. So when we talk about estimates, and I mentioned that they're team-based, and when we say team, I'll just say capital T, team-based, which means it's all of the work to be done. One of the anti-patterns that if you see this happening, I'm sure it's done with good intentions. I've seen folks do it with good intentions, but it's a team-based estimate and it is a comprehensive estimate. So if you start to see your team saying, well, the dev work is 1 point and the QA work is 3 points and the BA work is 1 point and the deployment work, it is not an additive approach. And that's where the danger of things like math come in, is that you can start applying those same mathematical principles, but they don't work in this context. So we don't add those points together. We talk about the work in its entirety, from what we need to do to start on that item to what we need to do to get it to production. Thank you for that question. I've got some other questions that are coming up in the chat. I will try to address those if they're not addressed in the remainder of the conversation. And I see some really good questions in there. I'll try to, again, some of those may be addressed as we get further on through here. And if not, in the last 10 minutes or so of the session that we have, we'll try to go through those questions in Q&A. So planning poker. If you have not used planning poker as an approach if you haven't started estimation yet, then obviously you haven't. If you've done estimation before and you've not used planning poker, this is a great technique. Teams generally find it fun, and it does also address the issue that I was mentioning on that prior slide, the question that Kevin had brought up about those estimates and what they're inclusive of. When we bring the full team in, we've got the ability to do team-based estimation with planning poker. You can, in the olden days of 2019, we actually had physical cards. You can still get them. Our friends at Mountain Goat Software are normally where I get ours, but you can get them from a number of other sources as well. There's also online vehicles for doing planning poker. And if you don't even want to do that, I've actually done it in Teams or in other video conferencing for remote teams or hybrid teams, by just having folks throw their estimates in the chat window, as long as you have everyone throw them in at exactly the same time. Won't talk a whole lot about planning poker today, but it does have an analog to the actual game of poker itself. It's not just because I'm in Vegas today, but the idea of poker is, showing your cards at that same moment, the same idea. We want to avoid really looking at other people's estimates to have implicit or explicit bias. So planning poker, if you're getting started with estimation, this can be a great way to have a fun start into estimating your work and having that great conversation as part of the estimation process. So whether physical cards or online, each estimator gets a deck of cards. By the way, only the people who are doing the work, as mentioned on the prior slide, only the people doing the work actually get to vote. So anyone in positional power, your product owner, anybody who is a representative for the customer, et cetera, unless they're doing hands-on work, they're not involved in this process. They get to have an opinion, they don't get to have a vote. because they're not doing the work. So they can't really estimate it on anybody else's behalf. But the folks who are doing the work will get a deck of cards. The person, whether it's the product owner or whomever is the representative of the customer, maybe the customer themselves, will actually explain to the team what the need is, what the actual item is that's going to be estimated from a business perspective. Any questions that come up certainly can be asked, and the team can ask any questions that they need to get a better understanding so that they can estimate well. Estimators then privately select their cards. Again, the idea of poker is we don't want to show anybody else what we're thinking as far as our estimates. But when it's time, we will turn those cards over, everybody at the same time. And this is part of that beauty. What I was talking about at the beginning of our conversation is one of the key, and I think often underappreciated benefits of estimation isn't the estimate. It's the dialogue that happens. So I've had my teams in meetings where we had somebody from QA came up with I think it was a 3, and the developer who was going to be doing the primary work came up with a 1. And so we got this great opportunity to say, well, you two were at the sort of the bounds of this on behalf of the entirety of the team. So what were you each thinking when you did your estimate? And we're not trying to convince anybody that ours is right. This is not a negotiation. It is an elaboration. So at that point, the developer said, well, it's just a couple of lines of code. This is the change I'm going to make. It's pretty straightforward, easy to develop, not a whole lot of risk. That was my 1. And then the woman who was leading the QA efforts on the team said, well, here are all of the test cases that I'm going to need to change. This is what I'm going to need to build. And nobody was trying to convince anybody of their perspective, but they were sharing the nature of the work based on their discipline that they were doing, and then the magnitude and the nature of that work. And after that conversation, when we had that shared understanding, again, that first bullet point that I had on my beloved OWL slide, the shared understanding was really what was valuable there. And then when we get the ability to discuss those differences, again, we're not trying to convince anybody to come over to our side, but we want to make sure they understand the work and our considerations there and any clarifications. And then we re-estimate at that point. And generally, that'll get us pretty close to the point where folks are basically on the same page. And if they're not, there's some techniques that I won't go into today. But in the majority of cases where I've had this happen, it's really been those light bulbs go off in such a good way, and that everybody really understands the nature of the work. The example that I gave is one really good one. The other one is that having conversations, if there are differences that come up related to things that your product owner or the customer proxy customer themselves may be able to clarify about basically what's in or outside of scope, some questions that they may not have thought of that we come up with as we're estimating, and that will help us understand the magnitude of that estimate. So some thoughts moving forward. The first thing is, remember the law of diminishing returns. I did this deck, by the way, before I was in Vegas, so I don't know if I was just thinking about the fact that I was going to be in a place that had a lot of poker type references. It may just be serendipitous. All of that said, the law of diminishing returns, especially as estimation, and this is one of those areas I often sort of see the metaphor of that pendulum swing of we go from no estimates to going into and really wanting to go deep dive into estimates. We really want great estimates. So as far as the time spent estimating, we don't want to overthink those estimates. We don't want to overdo it. They're estimates, not commitments. If somebody is trying to hold you to an estimate, just quote The Princess Bride, and probably don't do that in your real context. But we want to make sure that we're approaching them as estimates and that they will also improve over time. But a reliable estimate and really looking at where we have this point of diminishing returns, there's definitely going to be some value spending some time estimating, not just for those numbers again, but for the conversation. But we're not looking for excessive precision here. That is not the point of this exercise. And again, also knowing that the more that we do this, like almost everything in agile ways of working and in life in general, the more that we do it, the better we will be at it. We don't want to try to be perfect out of the gate. So I don't know that obviously there's no numbers on this graph, but you'll have to figure out what that is in your context. But it's a good question to ask yourself periodically, especially as you're starting out, but also to consider with the team. Where is that sweet spot where you're getting enough information out of your estimates that it's helpful for your planning and for clarity and shared understanding? And where are you getting to the point where you are trying to actually take an estimate and make it inappropriately and largely limited value in terms of the estimate becoming an actual explicit commitment? There's some other things to be thinking about as far as estimation when you start this with your team. And these are things that even for a mature team, these might be things to just sort of constantly, not constantly, to periodically revisit and make sure that you are being thoughtful in a real pragmatic way as far as your estimates. So when people estimate, and I have seen this for traditional and agile projects and products as well, when we estimate work, we're not always cognizant of what the efficiency impact is, the size impact is for handoffs between people and teams. So again, if we're doing a team-based estimate, that includes all of the different people and all of the different teams involved from inception to the delivery of that item. So we need to be cognizant, especially for shared teams, for fractional membership, those sorts of things, what is that impact going to be in terms of that effort? Relatedly, delays between development steps. Again, those add to the level of size, complexity, and risk if there are going to be significant delays or multiple handoff points along the way. This may be also fighting words a little bit, but as far as waste work, not all documents, reports, and features, et cetera, are waste, but anything that is unneeded, that is superfluous, that is just done because it's traditional, but creating documents related to that work that nobody will ever read, those sorts of things, try to challenge those along the way, because they may not be, if you need to do them, they need to be factored into the overall amount of effort. It may be 3 lines of code in an easy test, but if you need to update all of your release notes and web pages and other things, that's part of getting that work to capital D done. And we need to be thinking about that. If you can get rid of the unneeded work, great. If it's actually needed, make sure that's factored into your estimate. Multitasking and excess work in process. So that's another area where when we're estimating, especially with fractional teams or teams that are working on multiple things simultaneously, again, often software support teams or teams that are handling maintenance work or things that span more than just one heads down focus item in a particular sprint. If we're bouncing between multiple items, this idea of impacting flow and context shifting, don't underestimate that, in no pun intended, don't underestimate that in your estimates, because that will be a negative factor in terms of what the size of those things are. A 1-point story, if people can pick it up for half an hour at a time and then have to pick it up 3 days later for a half an hour, how much time does it take the human brain to readjust to the context on that particular item and then to work on it? So if you can't change that reality, obviously that's ideal, but if you cannot change that reality based on the nature of your team and your context, be realistic about how you size that work in your world. And again, related to a number of the above, that team churn, if we're changing members, if we have new staff who don't have the same technical or business context, domain knowledge, or that fractional allocation, all of those things, that's where that 1-point story, that 5-point story for team A that's been long-lived, well-established, they are in the performing stage of that cycle. That's going to be a very different dynamic and size of work than a team that's fractional, that assembles periodically to work on certain things and has to disassemble or work on different items. So again, be cognizant of what your estimates would be in that context, because they're going to be impacted by these things in the real world. And these factors are often not thought of in any sort of detail when we're emerging with our estimates. We have sort of this blue sky idea that, we're going to estimate based on working in a world that none of us actually live in. And that's just something we want to be pragmatic and realistic so that our estimates are meaningful. So remember when I said there wasn't any secret magic decoder ring? So this is not a secret magic decoder ring. But it's also a real world pragmatic approach. So if you leave today and you haven't been estimating, or you've been doing it differently, and you think that this might be something that you want to start trying with one of your teams. So how do you get started with no initial velocity? How do we start estimating? I don't know what a 1 is relative to my team. It's relative. It's not absolute. It's team specific, etc. So here's an idea to get started. So for every full-time engineer and tester on the team, I just say, if you want to replace the words engineer and tester in your context, these are people doing the hands-on work. Managers, unless they're doing hands-on work, don't count. Not in this context. Obviously, you count. But anyone who's actually doing the hands-on work gets 8 points. Subtract 1 point for each team member, vacation day, and holiday. Find a small story. And again, small is in your context, in your backlog, that would take about a day to develop. So even if you have 0 estimates on anything right now, normally we can find something and we can say, okay, collectively, not just the dev work, but between any analysis that's required, development, quality assurance, even deployment, if we could do that basically in a day, that would be 1. That's basically the smallest that we can get. We'll start with that. And again, that's this idea of relative sizing. We need something to baseline with our cute puppies, right? So this is our 1. And then we estimate other stories all relative to that one, the cute puppies page, right? So now if I know what that cute little puppy with the little ribbon in its hair, if that's my 1, so now I actually have a baseline that I can work with to do that triangulation. And then after the first iteration, you'll start using your actual velocity. So this is really just a one-time event. If you're doing Scrum, then that would be generally 2 weeks. But whatever your first iteration is, and if you're not doing iterations that are short enough, choose a period of time. But generally, I would have that to be 2 weeks to a month maximum. And then use that as your velocity. Once you've gotten through that first iteration or that first sprint, then you've got real numbers to work with. But this is sort of a way to bridge from nothing to get you started. In this example, if I've got a 5-person team, 3 devs, 2 testers, so again, no product owner, no Scrum Master, those roles are incredibly important, but you're not doing the hands-on work, so you don't get a vote and you don't get a point. That capacity would be, 5 team members, 8 points. So you get 40 points per iteration. And let's see, get some references here, and then I'm going to try to pick up all of the questions in order from the chat.